This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
AI is incredible. It can teach you how to fry an egg and even write a poem, pirate style. Yarr! But it knows nothing about your work. Slackbot is different. It doesn't just know the facts. It knows your schedule. It can turn a brainstorm into a brief. And it doesn't need to be taught. Because Slackbot isn't just another AI. It's AI that knows your work as well as you do. Visit slack.com/meet Slackbot to learn more.
Hello friend. Do come in, relax, make yourself comfortable, and welcome to the History Book Club. A club that welcomes all history lovers. Drink? Now, shall we begin?
The idea of a loyal opposition that we now are quite familiar with, which actually grows up in the sort of mid to late 18th century, is not something that really anybody has a concept of. Both parties see the other party as an illegitimate faction, but one that they have to sort of put up with because they don't really have any other option, because they're a social and political reality that they sort of have to live with. Wharton, who is one of the leading Whigs, and Viscount Buddenbrook, who is one of the leading Tories, are rakes on a proper 18th century scale. You know, they love nothing better than washing down, a huge meal with three bottles of Burgundy and then going off to see a prostitute. I mean, that's their idea of a night out, basically, and then having a fight usually at some point.
Hello. This week's episode takes us to late 17th and early 18th century Britain, a time when politics as we recognise today was formed. The development of the party system, Whigs and Tories, the Act of Union with Scotland, and foreign wars often unpopular at home. Joining me is George Owers. Joining me in the club is George Owers. As you heard, he describes a fantastic romp through the period, which is the subject of his book, The Rage of Party. Please do share the History Book Club pod with your friends, passers-by, your doctor, and fellow passengers on public transport. Coming up, Saving Private Ryan will be the inaugural History Film Club episode, but until then, let's head straight in. George, a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Well, George, I'm so pleased to be able to speak to you because I've really been enjoying your book. And so the book's title for the listeners is The Rage of Party, How Whig versus Tory Made Modern Britain. It is, there are so many resonances with today, I suppose. I kind of probably got a little bit carried away whilst I was reading it, thinking, oh my God, this is just like we've been going through in the last sort of 10 years or so. This is a period of history that's really not covered that much in commercial non-fiction, I don't think. Is that the case?
Yeah, it's not covered very much in academic non-fiction, let alone commercial. The only books that ever cover this era that you might find in Waterstones, other than mine, is probably a biography of Queen Anne, or a book about the Favourite, which is a book about Queen Anne and her relationship with the Duchess of Marlborough, was fairly big because there was a film about it. That's probably about the only book that is, and obviously that really doesn't, that touches all those. Obviously, are the politics of the era are relevant, but they obviously focus much more on the personal story of Queen Anne and her vexed relationship with her chief personal servant / retainer, Duchess of Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough. So no, it's been neglected for a long time. I mean, there was a boom of academic interest in the 60s and 70s. It was quite a big topic. There was Geoffrey Holmes, and Bill Speck were the two sort of superstars who, in academic history, insofar as academic history has superstars, who wrote the books that are still really in many ways the definitive academic books on the subject. And since certainly about the 80s, It tracks the broader decline of interest in political history in anything like a conventional sense, particularly pre-20th century. It's astonishingly. I mean, at most history departments barely teach British political history before. The only extent to which they do is as sort of survey courses on general British history, or occasionally the only interest really in the sort of traditional political history now and constitutional history is largely sort of a cultural history of politics, which is fine, but it's become extraordinarily. Even the more you'd think periods which are more sort of famous, like I don't know, sort of 19th century, sort of the era of Disraeli and Gladstone or whatever. Even that. I mean, I think there's a suspicion of of what you might call sort of traditional political and constitutional history, because there's the general view of sort of academia and the way academia's drifted is that they don't like stories that focus too much on high politics and the machinations of a small number of elite actors at the top. White dead men, I suppose, who and parliaments and elections and that sort of thing. And it's very seen as very unfashionable now, which I sort of understand why there was a reaction against it, because there was a time when British history, as taught in say universities, was basically purely political and constitutional history, which was a bit narrow. I understand why there's a reaction against that, but it seems to me that the reaction has gone way the other direction, such that basically no one works on it. I mean, there's almost nobody left in British academia who works on the political history of this period. So basically particularly the reigns of William III and Queen Anne, and even into the Georges, the Georgian era, and Hanoverians, very little. I mean, you have to really struggle to find any academic in any British or even American university who works on this sort of thing, which I find baffling, because the thing about political history and the machinations of prime ministers and ministers and what goes on in parliament and elections and stuff, of course, if you just study that, it can be narrow, but it's pretty important. I mean, one particular element of it which I find baffling is obviously the history of the British Empire is now very central to the way history is taught in universities. If you want to understand, there seems to be a curious lack of interest often in the domestic political context in which the British Empire emerged in the 18th, particularly sort of to some extent in the 17th century, but mostly in the 18th century. For example, it's not just this period; it's even later this period, like the 7 Years' War, very, very obscure. Not much. You can't find much on the 7 Years. 7 Years' War is basically when we acquire much of what becomes the basis, the British Empire. It's where we.
Yeah, well, George, I was going to say, funnily enough, I mean, I was very fortunate at A level to study history. A level, I studied English and European history. The period I started unusually, so much so that I have historians sort of can't believe that I was studying beginning with the reign of George I all the way through to the 7 Years' War, which was unusual. But
yeah, I mean that's even, I think, possibly more obscure than this era, or it's equally as obscure.
The South Sea Bubble, which I found riveting.
Yeah, I mean, this is, that the whole period is culminating in the great year of victories in the 7 Years' War and so on. I mean, Clive of India and all that sort of thing. It's like a pretty important period of Britain's growing power and wealth and so on, and which culminates in sort of high Victorianism. And you'd think that people might be interested in sort of why and how the British political and constitutional history shaped it, but I would say the other aspect of this is there's a bit of a suspicion of narrative history that is about sort of machinations of elites. Now, fair enough, but the thing is, it's quite good fun. I mean, one of the reasons why I love this era and I wanted to write a book about it, I want to write this book about it, is because there's just so many brilliant characters and often quite disreputable, sort of colourful characters in this story, and indeed in sort of British politics before the sort of rise of mass democracy in general, where if it's from people in my book like Robert Harley or the Earl of Wharton and so on, through to Pitt the Younger drinking 3 bottles of port a day whilst he's fighting the Napoleonic War. I mean, I just think that the personal side of this, I think there's a bit of a bias against people not wanting the fact that the people who they make important decisions, right? If you're a senior minister in a government, you are making quite important decisions, and you're drawn from quite a narrow band of aristocrats and the gentry, and the personal relationships that these people have with each other and with monarchs and so on are quite important, and also often quite dramatic and interesting. And I just think, I don't see there's anything wrong with being interested and amused and entertained by the antics of whoever it may be. In my book, Harley, Wharton, Bolingbroke, who are the main big characters, and then later on in the century, the Pelhams, Walpole, people like Charles Fox, and so on. Later in the century, I think they're very entertaining characters. And I hope my theory was that the reading public might actually be quite entertained by the sort of soap opera element of this, because it's, Queen Anne's relationships with her ministers, which were often shaped by her personal moral and religious views, and friendships and broken relationships, most famously with the Marlboroughs. For background, the Duke of Marlborough is the key military and in some ways political figure of Queen Anne's era, who is in charge of a colossal confrontation with the French and Louis XIV during the War of the Spanish Succession. And her personal relationships to those two people, and his wife. So his wife is one of Queen Anne's senior sort of confidants and mistress of the wardrobe and so on. And the way that they fall out dramatically on a personal level, which is intertwined with the politics of the situation as well, is key to understand. I mean, and you may think that sounds like trivial, like the arguments that Queen Anne is having with Sarah Churchill in her bedchamber, and indeed her fallings out with the Duke of Marlborough. They're important because they determine the course of war and peace in Europe. Or at least they have a very strong impact on that. I think the Europe reaching peace and the outcomes of a tumultuous. The War of Spanish Succession is a very important war. There's so many wars with. I think often people get a bit fatigued with the fact that we fight so many wars with France throughout the course of the 18th century. There's the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War, Revolutionary War. People slightly get fatigued. But this is the sort of first major war we've had with France for a long time, the War of the Spanish Succession, and it's the key context for understanding much.
I think you mentioned it. I think you mentioned it's sort of the previous war was the 100 Years' War, which I kind of had me scratching my head, thinking surely not, but it is, isn't it?
Well, obviously there'd been wars with France under the Tudors, but they'd usually been pretty minor affairs. There's the very early Stuart monarchs have descents led by the Earl of Buckingham on Calais or whatever it was. But they usually we lose very quickly, and and that's it. I'm talking about a major land war fought, in which the entire the British state, not only did the British state marshal pretty much all of the resources it could, it transformed the British state. The British probably several war is often the thing that drives the big change in the rise and the power and of the influence and the financial muscle and so on of the state. This is the John Brewer's famous book, The Sinews of War, which is the sort of original the academic Bible on this. But the way that it's easy to forget how rackety the British state is by any modern standards. It is into the 18th century, but in the 17th century, the British state, and in terms of a war mob fighting machine and a tax collecting machine, is very rackety and amateurish. It's not in this war.
And then there's no sort of formalized parties administering any of this.
No. I'm not an expert on sort of on the politics of the sort of earlier 17th century, but political parties are not a thing. There are factions sort of in the 1640s as the Puritans, react against Charles I and so on. But there's nothing like a political party on any sort of, in any sense. Obviously the political parties I'm writing about in this book are different. They're a sort of intermediate beast, if you like, between. So they're not political parties in the sense of there's a formal leader and there's a very centralized organization and they have conferences and they make nice speeches and all this sort of thing. It's not like that, but it's recognisably starts to become something that's sort of halfway house to a modern political party. The parties, they start as very loose factions. emerging, in particularly in reaction to an event, which is the exclusion crisis. So when James II, who's as he's then at the time, the James Duke of York is the heir to the throne, and he's a Roman Catholic, and this creates a huge controversy about whether he should remain the heir to Charles II. It's for the reason that obviously at this point prejudice against Roman Catholics is in Protestant, what is now firmly Protestant England and Scotland. It's a massively controversial, and so they start off as very loose factions around this issue. So basically, the Whigs are pro-exclusion because they're defined as much as anything, certainly early on, by their extremely violent anti-Catholicism, which is a key element of the early part of this book. And the Tories, the Tories are even less well defined early on. The Tories are gradually sort of come together as the group of people who support the king, the king's desire to keep the succession to the throne as it is, and are broadly speaking what you might call the Church and King party, who believe in divine right and so on. Whereas the Whigs they're anti-Catholic, but they're also much more aligned to what we would call dissent. So that's like Protestant Christians outside the Church of England.
So we got the Civil War looming here, George. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
But I guess that, the two sides are a kind of hangover still from the Civil War.
Yeah, and that's very, very alive in the imaginations of the people fighting this party war. They still self-consciously are sort of have an identity as the heirs of the Cavalier cause in the case of the Tories and the parliamentarian cause in the case of the Whigs. I mean, they are very self-conscious of it, particularly the Tories. I think the Tories, because the Whigs are a little bit more equivocal about it, because by this point, the more radical extremes of the Civil War and the Commonwealth and the execution of Charles I are more controversial and less straightforward as a political tradition, shall we say, because of course after the Restoration, there's something of a taboo about cutting off a king's head, even amongst the more radical, well, certainly amongst most of the Whigs. So the Whigs are not quite so keen to claim the mantle, although they clearly do see continuity in the more radical Whigs are more willing to take on that mantle. The Tories are very vehemently see the politics of their day as a sort of continuation of that of the Civil War. They see themselves as the heirs of the Cavaliers, and even more importantly, in their imagination, they see the Whigs as the heirs of what they just would see as the regicides and revolutionaries and anarchists and violent, fanatics of the parliamentary side during the Civil War. So that is part of it's a curious thing, because on the one hand, that fuels the bitterness to some degree. You've got to bear in mind, of course, at the start of this period, the Civil War is still in living memory of a lot of people. It's so the party sort of basically form around about 1680, and at this point, if you're an old man, you will remember. There were still a lot of people around who remembered and were there for the Civil War. So the wounds are still very strong. And for example, a good example of this is the Tories. Two things here. The Tories are very keen on invoking the what we might call the sort of cult of Charles I, of Charles King and Martyr. So they see invoking Charles as a religious martyr for the Church of England, and his execution is the sort of central point that proves that the dissenters and who are the heirs of the Puritans proves a bunch of sort of evil disturbers of order and peace they are. They chopped off the head of a king, and then they also like to play on the persecution of Anglican, what we would now call Anglicans, so churchmen, during the Commonwealth period. So there's a book written about that, which becomes sort of an important Tory political propaganda piece, which is about the sufferings of the clergy during the 1650s. So the Tories love play, and they're almost every election or whenever there's a particular height of political tension, the Tories love saying things like "This is 41, come again," or this, they want to chop off the monarch's head and all this sort of thing. It's very heated. But the sort of paradox of it is whilst they invoke the passions of the mid-17th century and the Civil War and everything, this is also the period where those tensions, which are rooted in religion particularly, but also to some extent in sort of ideas about the nature of monarchy and the constitution, those tensions are still there and they're still fueling the party heat, but also this is a period where those tensions are become managed within a peaceful-ish system of organised party politics that sort of domesticates these passions to some degree. I mean, that said, this is still a period where the politics is a bit more raw-edged than we might be used to today. Well, certainly in British politics today. This is still a period where elections are often quite heated affairs, where crowds like to batter each other with pikes and halberds and medieval weapons, and politicians will still threaten each other to put each other in the Tower of London and possibly even execute each other. But that is fading, and I think the memory of the Civil War fuels the party tension, but it also makes people reluctant to want to enter into war. So they reluctantly, in many ways, the adoption of political parties, the system of political parties, is something that the British political elite are not very keen on, even as they engage in it. So it's slightly a paradoxical situation where they don't really, the idea of a loyal opposition, right, that we now are quite familiar with, which actually grows up in the sort of mid to late 18th century, is not something that really anybody has a concept of. Both parties see the other party as an illegitimate faction, but one that they have to sort of put up with because they don't really have any other option, because they're a social and political reality that they sort of have to live with. But there's no concept of the part of a party being a loyal opposition. They hate each other and see each other as illegitimate factions, but they generally are reluctant to resort to actually physically killing each other, which is an advance of a kind. And so the partisan tensions and hatreds become regularized and largely moderated, and then by the sort of mid 18th century they've become much more dampened down. But this is the point where it all plays itself out and resolves itself in a partly violent and sort of partly it has a feel half of like being very early modern or even medieval, like quite violent and quite riven with religious hatreds and sectarianism. But it's also just, you can see those things are just starting to dampen down, and it's starting to become more modern. So that's what one of the things I think is most fascinating about the era is it's a bit of in between. It's sort of, you can sometimes see glimpses of party politics which seem almost very modern, but there's still an underlying menace to it, which is a bit more 17th century, if you know what I mean.
I wanted to ask about the electorate at the time, because for listeners may be unaware of how limited it was. I mean, and of course the monarch appoints ministers as well, which is something that may be unfamiliar.
I mean, you say it's limited, and of course, by modern standards, the electorate is limited, of course, but it wasn't a democracy. But I think the thing that's probably more surprising is that how big it was actually, but in this period. Because so we're talking the last few decades of the 17th and the first few decades of the 18th century, the British electorate was probably, well, the best estimates are that about a quarter of men had the vote, and no women, of course. But now a quarter of men is obviously fairly nugatory by the standards of universal suffrage, but the electorate had actually been increasing throughout the 17th century quite a lot for various reasons, partly because some of the property qualifications had been eroded by inflation, essentially, and partly because the mad electoral system allowed certain corporations, which are basically like councils, more or less, to actually somewhat arbitrarily increase their own electorate by appointing freemen of the borough and all this sort of thing. So actually, the electorate's been growing if we get to the height of party tensions, sort of in the reign of Queen Anne, the electorate's been growing for a long time, and actually the electorate gets much smaller throughout the rest of the 18th century. So actually, the electorate is small. By the time the Great Reform Act is passed in 1832, the electorate is quite considerably smaller than it had been in, say, 1710, 120 years before. Because the Whigs spend much of the 18th century chipping away at the electorate, because by the time the Whigs gain pretty much complete power, they're keen. They don't want a big electorate, because if you have a big electorate, you have to bribe them, which is expensive. So it's keen. They're keen on restricting the franchise in the mid 18th century. But in this period, there's a bit, But the key to understanding the electorate of this period and the electoral system is that it's madly inconsistent. There is no uniform franchise. It varies. Now, the only uniform franchise, so basically there are two types of seats: the county seats and borough seats. And borough seats are towns generally, or cities as we would now sort of call them, that have officially been enfranchised and been given their own MP, and everybody else votes in the county. And the county seats have a uniform franchise, 40 shilling freehold franchise. But the boroughs, which are the majority of the seats, every seat basically has a different franchise. Now, you can there are some regularities, you can put them into categories. But even then, I mean, a lot of seats are almost sui generis. They have bizarre mixtures of different electoral franchises. So some seats, every inhabitant, male inhabitant can vote. So Preston, for example, every male who's living in the town of the day of the election can vote. Some places, the vote is linked to certain properties, burgage boroughs, as they're called. So basically real estate in the constituency. So in some places, 5 people or 10 or 20 people have a vote, and they're basically what we later know will become known as infamous later on as bottom boroughs. And in between, there's a whole. So in some places, the corporation members of the corporation can vote, and that's essentially councillors, if you like, aldermen or members of the corporation, which is very small electorates. That might be 30. That's usually like 24 people or whatever. In some places, freemen of the borough can vote, and the mayor and the corporation can create as many freemen as they like, almost pretty much arbitrarily, and they usually do that to benefit their own party interests. So they'll just create huge numbers of voters who they know probably will vote for them. And in other places, it's pot walloper, which is meant to be people who can afford to have a hearth to heat a pot. I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, I can't even begin to go into the ins and outs of the finer points of it because it's bizarre. So some seats are very open and have a very big electorate, like often close to all men. Some is 3 men and a dog. So that means, but I would say broadly speaking, there's a big enough electorate in an era when literacy has been rising throughout the 17th century. The press is deregulated, so censorship, pre-publication censorship is repealed in the mid-1690s. So there's a growing press, and more men can read, and there are enough voters that mean that public opinion is becoming a meaningful force in politics in a way which it hadn't really been. It sort of had to some extent maybe in the 1640s, particularly the London mob, so on. But on a national basis, public opinion does become a meaningful force in British politics, and politicians sort of have to realise that they need to appeal to public opinion. And there's a floating vote. I mean, there are a lot of the electorate is being manipulated by local elites. Like there's the usual local landowners who have a lot of power, but there's enough of a floating vote that means that politicians have to take it. They have to care what newspapers write, and they employ their own journalists. Most famously, people like Jonathan Swift and Daniel Defoe, who both write for Robert Harley, who's one of the more important and visible figures. So public opinion is becoming really quite important to British politics, and you can see this in the fact that there's huge swings in elections. There are landslides for the Tories. For example, 1710 is famously a colossal landslide for the Tories, partly because of a reaction against the Whigs, because the Whigs have been perceived to persecute this parson called Dr. Saint-Gevrel, who gave a controversial sermon, and it's a sort of basically there's a perception that the Whigs are against the Church of England, and this sets off a massive sort of outrage and reaction in the country, and Dr. Saint-Gevrel becomes this great hero, and he travels the country being garlanded and given feasts and firework displays and God knows what. And it's clear that public opinion has moved very heavily against the Whigs, and the Whigs get absolutely destroyed in the election. They fall to their lowest ever number of seats. So in some ways, that it seems more modern than mid 18th century politics, when politics is very much Robert Walpole or a small number of other Whig oligarchs who are very much manipulating things. There are still elections, but they don't have anywhere near as much importance really, because the Whigs are almost guaranteed to win most elections in some way or another. So yeah, and in terms of the broader constitutional settlement, I think we think that after the Glorious Revolution, so the Glorious Revolution is one of the key events in the book, because it sort of defines the parameters of much of this, or partly, it defines a large element of the parameters of the politics of this era. People think after the Glorious Revolution, this is some sort of watershed in constitutional history, and in a way it is. And its main watershed is it establishes Parliament as a permanent feature that, before this, parliaments were always called. I mean, Charles II had reigned the last 4 years of his reign. Charles II reigned without a parliament. And obviously Charles I spent a lot of time ruling without a parliament. After the Glorious Revolution, for various reasons, largely because Parliament has learned its lesson and won't fund the government. It won't give it will only give very limited and short-term supply to the government. For financial, it's a sort of financial thing as much as a constitutional thing, really. Parliament becomes a permanent thing, which is, it's a yearly event, an institution, not just an occasional event, if you like. But, and therefore, Parliament has to be managed. The governments have to get particularly their taxes and stuff through Parliament. That is now completely non-negotiable. But the monarch still retains a hell of a lot of power. They still appoint the government and the ministers, and they still see basically ministers as their personal servants, really, in a way, and they still retain most of their prerogative powers. They don't really lose any significant prerogative powers that they had before the Glorious Revolution. They still have the right to declare war, to make foreign treaties. Monarchs still have an awful lot of power, basically. And William III, when he comes in after the Glorious Revolution, is a Dutchman who is brought in because of basically England doesn't want to be run by James II because he's been promoting his Roman Catholic religion. William III comes in and he's a sort of weak hero, but William III does not want to rule. He sees himself very much as a ruler who wants his own way, which is part of the reason why there were some tensions between him and the Whigs in the 1690s, and indeed as it comes increasingly with the Tories. So the Constitution hasn't changed that much, and you still get monarchs vetoing legislation. No, William vetoes a lot of bills. It starts to, Queen Anne doesn't do it so much, but the last time a bill passed by Parliament, by both houses of Parliament, is vetoed by the monarch is in the reign of Queen Anne. So this is still a period where monarchs are not negligible factors. The big thing that they have to do is get their things through Parliament, and that has been massively complicated by the fact that these two political parties have come up, and they can't. Parliaments before that, you could often do deals with individuals. There was a lot of there wasn't a formal political divide, but now the monarch has to deal with these quite powerful party leaders who want to force they want the monarch to appoint ministers of one party or another. So the Tories want themselves in power, and the Whigs obviously want themselves in power. And the monarch has to deal with this, and the monarch, generally speaking, the monarch still has to deal with these party leaders. And if a party has a big majority in Parliament and the party's united, it can, in theory, force an agenda on the monarch and say, look, you have to do this. We won't give you supply. We won't vote taxes through. So the job of the monarch, aided by sort of court advisors and parliamentary managers who they recruit, has to try to negotiate their way through this. And there's all sorts of, and much of the political machinations of my book are about how a series of non-party managers who are, so Godolphin, who is the Lord Treasurer for quite a long time under Queen Anne, and then also Robert Harley, who is Speaker of the House of Commons, and then later on he becomes Lord Treasurer as well. How these figures are trying to manage the party magnates and the unruly backbenchers of the various parties to try to divide and rule them off them, or to try to do deals with them, or whatever, in order so that the monarch can get their business through without having to be dictated to by the parties. And the biggest fear of the monarch, and this is something that Queen Anne is particularly hates, well, actually William does as well, but Queen Anne is particularly prone to or vulnerable to what is called forcing the chamber, which means a party will put her in a position where they say, well, you have to appoint our leading figures, in the case of the Whigs, it's the junta, which is a group of lords who basically run the Whig party and are very high and mighty. And they want to force the chambers. They want to say to Queen, you have to appoint us to the senior government positions, otherwise we won't play ball with you in Parliament, and we're too powerful in Parliament for you to ignore us, essentially. And the Tories often try something similar, although the Tories have the big problem, which the Tories are endemically disunited. The Tories are always falling out over something or another amongst themselves, And so usually
No change there, yeah.
yeah, I know some things don't change, and often because the parties don't have the disciplinary power over their backbenchers. They do have whips. They do try to impose discipline on their parties, but it's much harder. It's a bit more, So nowadays, modern political parties, Labour or Tories, whatever, if you don't play ball, the party can suspend the whip, and then they can probably make sure you don't get to stand as the party candidate in the next general election, and that probably means you're going to lose your seat. So parties have quite a lot of power now. In those days, the whips could try to persuade backbenchers to vote on a certain way and a certain thing, but the backbenchers had a lot more power because there was no formal process of selecting candidates. There was no central party organisation was very weak, and also most of the MPs were themselves powerful local figures. They were landowners. They employed a lot of people. They had a big sway in the constituency, and they could win. And there was no question of anyone. They decided who the parliamentary candidates for the Whig interest or the Tory interest were, and there was no way that party leaders in Westminster so the tail of the backbenchers wags the dog a lot particularly the Tories. So for example, there's a powerful backbench group called the October Club who become particularly powerful in the latter reign of Queen Anne, who are the most sort of extreme Tory. So they're the very, very keen on promoting the sort of religious monopoly of the Church of England and dishing the dissenters by various means of passing laws to make it much harder for the dissenters to worship and in various ways. And they were also very pro-peace, because the other dynamic of this era is maybe somewhat counterintuitively in the minds of people. A lot of people maybe see these things through 20th century lens. The Tories are essentially the peace party.
Yeah. Throughout the 18th century, they hate war, don't they? Even the 7 Years' War, they were uncomfortable with it.
So basically, this is because the backbone of the Tory support are the gentry, the sort of particularly the lower gentry, the squire, the stereotypical. If you've ever read like Tom Jones by Fielding, the sort of squire, the squire western, or the fox hunting, shooting, fishing, usually quite drunken squire, who are landowners, but they're not big land, they're often quite, relatively speaking, the smaller landowners, and they hate war for various reasons. But overwhelmingly because they have to pay for it. Because the way that the taxation system works at this time is very crude. It's becoming more sophisticated, but still pretty crude taxation system. So there is no such thing. Obviously, there's no until the Napoleonic Wars. There's no such thing as income tax or whatever. The two sources of tax that overwhelmingly bring in the money are the land tax, which is a tax on as the name suggests, landowners, and customs and excise. Hence why 18th century politicians are so keen on stopping smuggling, basically, because that's one of the main sources of money. And also to some extent, commodity taxes to some extent on things like leather or whatever it may be, silk, beer, and all this sort of thing.
Wine and port.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so the squires, who form the backbone of the Tory party, the tax burden falls overwhelmingly on them, and obviously they pass it on to their tenants and so on. So it's, but nonetheless, there's no. Whereas what you also have the other key issue in this period, which is in some ways probably the most important legacy of this, of this era, which still is a central factor of British life, which is the rise of the power of the City of London and the rise of the national debt and the associated financial interests of the bondholders, what they call the stock jobbers and so on of the time. And so
this is so crucial, isn't it? In Britain's rise, actually, in the following century.
It's the central thing, probably. So basically, the British state before the 1690s, the way it borrows money is very haphazard. The Charles II is always sort of struggling to pay back often sort of the gold merchant bankers who lend money at very high interest rates, very short term, very amateurish, to be honest. So in the 1690s, William III wants to fight this war against the French, and it's a modern war, the first modern war Britain that's the first sort of war on a modern scale with new technology and stuff. It's massively expensive. it's sort of expensive on a scale. So British spending, the spending of the British state averages under James II, so the previous monarch, £1.7 million a year. Under William III, the British state expenditure goes up to, it vacillates between £5 and £6 million a year. So British state expenditure essentially like triples basically over at least over this period, and taxes go up. But the gentry are not, who pay most of the taxes. They will put up with a certain amount of tax increase, which they're not very happy about. But there's no way that you can increase taxes enough to cover the costs of the war without the squires going absolutely, just refusing permission. The only way, therefore, to pay for the war is to borrow money. And William III basically, and his ministers, he's in the mid-1690s, his weaker ministers, know that they can't carry on with the very amateurish, sort of short-term, high-interest rate status quo, because they just can't borrow money on the scale or the other, time range that they need. So they set up the Bank of England in an order to, and which basically raises money by asking for subscriptions from moneyed interests in the city, and it's very successful. It means, I won't bore you with the details, but it's very bumpy, so it doesn't immediately transform everything. But over a period of about 10 or 15 years, it really does change the face of the British state. It means basically debt which is underpinned by promises from Parliament that it will pay back the debt and the interest over the long term, which is the key point. Because if you don't know the Parliament is going to sit, or people aren't very keen on lending money to the government because it knows that the main source of money is taxes. But if, as was the case under the Stuart monarchs, basically, Parliament might not sit, you don't know, it's all very uncertain. People don't really want to lend money to the British government, and certainly they don't want to lend it on very good terms. So the setting up of the Bank of England, which is linked to the rise of Parliament as a permanent institution, means that the British state can raise a lot more money at a lower interest rate for a lot longer period of time. And this is sort of a faltering process, but it's very clearly happens. And this allows the British state to massively increase the amount of money it borrows and spends. Now, as it turns out, because the British economy over the 18th century, over this period and then later, actually is growing and then takes off even more in the late 18th century, actually this debt proves to be completely sustained. Actually, doesn't prove to be sustainable. In fact, it's the key to Britain's rise into power.
Yeah, and France can't compete with that, can they?
Well, no, exactly. Well, that's why, in the end, looking forward to, say, by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but certainly in particular this early period, ultimately the reason why we in these long, what is sometimes called the Second 100-Year War, right? Because we're fighting France for more than 100 years, really, over the course of the sort of long 18th century. Why people, I think ultimately the reason we win is really because we have a better organised state, better organised finances. We're better able to tap the money and resources of the country to the purposes of war. That is the front. There's all sorts of other reasons, obviously, but it's not just because Nelson and Wellington or indeed Marlborough and so on were heroes. You might say that's a factor, but basically it's because the British state is better at raising money, it's better organised, it's better also at raising taxes. And the French system is obviously hopelessly compromised by the fact it's wildly decentralised, and various monarchs find it almost impossible to persuade the French aristocrats to pay any money. This is what brings down. It's called sort of what causes the French Revolution, right? The fact that the French monarchy can't really, lurches from one financial crisis to another because it doesn't have a centralised, powerful system of taxation and raising and borrowing money. But this emerges in this period, and becomes. And that leads in turn to the rise of the City of London as the great financial centre of the world, really. In things of lending money or insurance, shipping insurance, all these things. This is where it really takes off. And to this day, I would say that the British economy is clearly shaped very heavily by the fact that the finance is so powerful. But whether you think that's a good or bad thing is another question. But that's clearly, and this is the period to fund the War of Spanish Succession. And there's and obviously now we might say, certainly looking at the sort of 18th, 19th century, actually this is But it depends on whether you think Britain's rise to power and empire is a good thing or not. But whatever, it certainly wasn't the disaster, that a lot of people at the time thought it was. It's clearly
Well, that
was.
view reaches a sympathetic audience on this podcast, I would say.
Well, yes. So basically, so in retrospect, we see.
Sorry,
that,
I interrupted you.
No, you're fine.
Your train of thought.
No. But, in retrospect, we can see that this rise in debt and taxation and stuff didn't ruin the country. It actually led to Britain being very powerful and rich. But at the time, and particularly in the period of this book, my book, a lot of people are terrified of this. I think it's a terrible thing. They are scared of debt. They think that Britain becoming ever more indebted is ruinous potentially.
There's
but
almost a religious element to it, isn't it? It's like viewed as a kind of evil in a way.
Yes, although I think probably more relevant is it's also a profoundly political issue. So there is a sort of religious, almost like the idea of spending money you don't have, essentially, and I suppose probably sort of medieval prejudices against usury and lending and borrowing money. Clearly, it's very moralised in that sense, but it's also very politicised for the reason that the people who are if the people who are paying the taxes, i.e., the landed classes, the landed gentry, the squires, they also have to pay the interest, right, on the money that the state borrows. Whereas some people are making money out of this debt, i.e., the people who lend the money and charge interest, the financiers, what are often the money men, the stock jobbers, as the angry Tory squires would have called them at the time. And the Tory squires hate this because they're being charged ever higher taxes, which impoverishes them relatively speaking. I mean, obviously they're still landowners, but they certainly economically aren't doing brilliantly in this period relative to what they had before. But the financiers who make money because and they make money. They make the more war there is, the more money they make because the longer the war goes on and the more expensive it is, the more money the country needs to borrow. The more the country needs to borrow, the more interest they can make off of this. So the Tories are very resentful of these financiers, and you've also got to factor in getting in your head the idea the fact that they don't pay taxes. If you lend money to the government and you get paid back in interest, you don't pay any tax. There's no taxes. There's no taxation on that. It's pure profit for the financiers. And this is all turbocharged for the Tories by the fact that disproportionately the people who lend the money, the financiers, the money men, the bankers of the City of London, they are disproportionately dissenters. So the religious enemies of the squires, basically. The squires are almost all Anglicans, Church of England men, and they hate the dissenters, so basically the heirs of the Puritans, who they still see as their sort of ancestral enemy since the Civil War. And something like 40% of the directors of the Bank of England of this period are dissenters, which, when you consider that dissenters make up a very small percentage of the population, is very disproportionate. Dissenters have a reputation. There's a bit of a prejudice. It's not dissimilar to sort of prejudice against Jews for similar reasons. And of course, the reason why a lot of dissenters go into finance banking is because they are excluded from other things. Like they are not allowed to serve in public office, and quite a few informally or formally, quite a lot of other avenues of public and economic life are closed off to them. So, not unsurprisingly, one of the areas which isn't closed off to them is finance, banking. So a lot of dissenters go into banking, which is completely fair enough. I mean, then you would expect that. But of course, this leads to a prejudice against the dissenters by the Tory squires who religiously don't approve of them anyway. But they also see them as the sort of parasitical sort of men who profit from war, and there's some truth to this. I mean, the Bank of England does become very powerful in this period, and generally speaking, the Bank of England is very keen on war. Now, there's a sort of other factor which drives this, and you've got to bear this in mind, that hanging over this whole period is another thing which I haven't really mentioned, which is James II loses the crown.
Yeah.
There are plenty of people who think that he shouldn't have done. So they're the Jacobites, the people who want to restore James and his heirs to the throne, right? And they're off in France, and because of their Roman Catholics, and so they ally themselves with France, we are of course fighting a war against at the time. And the Jacobites now, in retrospect, we know that the Jacobites did not succeed. There was no restoration of the Stuart line, whatever. But of course, at the time, no one knew this, and there'd already been one restoration in 1660, and the Jacobites were thought that they were destined by the providence of God to recover the throne, and they're in cahoots with the French. Louis XIV, he waxes and wanes as to how much he will help them, but he does several times. There were several invasions. I mean, obviously, there's 1715 and the 1745, where later in the 18th century, where the Jacobites invade. But even before that, unsuccessfully, obviously. But before that, there are a number of assassination plots. There's several invasion attempts which fail miserably. They don't even get, 1708, for example. There's an invasion attempt by the Jacobites. They try to go to Scotland to raise the Highland clans, and with the French army. But for various reasons, it's a complete cock-up. The British fleet catches up with them. They don't land at the right place because they don't get the signal. I mean, the Jacobites are usually pretty shambolic.
They are always hopeless, aren't they?
They are pretty hopeless. It has to be said. Partly because they're very arrogant, and partly, and also they have no luck. I mean, they don't have the rub of the green. I think it's fair to say. But so hanging over this whole thing is that the entire political establishment that has come to power by the Glorious Revolution, that support a Protestant succession, that support William III, and then more equivocally, that and the real party that really represents that establishment is really the Whigs. But there's the whole issue that they fear that the Jacobites, that the Jacobites could win, and it's not completely without foundation, because of course the Jacobites themselves might be quite useless, but the French are not. The armies of Louis XIV are a much more formidable opponent, and the general view is that if Louis XIV routs the British and the Dutch in the War of the Spanish Succession, there's every chance that Louis XIV would restore a tame Jacobite Stuart line back to the throne of England. So it's not without foundation. The fact that it never comes to pass is partly because we do unexpect Britain, and as it becomes in this period, does unexpectedly well in the War of the Spanish Succession. So you've got to bear in mind that Louis XIV in his armies are seen as like the superpower of Europe. Like, they are easily the biggest army, the most technologically advanced army. They spent much of the previous, earlier in the 17th century, they've invaded all sorts of places. The Dutch have only held them off with great difficulty. And so, when there's a sort of stalemate war in the 1690s, so William does fight the French, doesn't really go anywhere. It's one of those wars which is just constant sieges, and no one ever seems to win. It costs a lot of money, and it sort of gets bogged down in a stalemate. But when the war resumes, there's a brief peace, but then war resumes in 1702. Most people thought the best Britain could do was another stalemate, like a very expensive. You can just get bogged down in sieges in the Flanders and hold the French off if you're lucky. But what actually happens, quite unexpectedly, is that it turns out that the Duke of Marlborough, who commands the Anglo-Dutch army, is a genius. He's a military genius, and he absolutely routs the French in a series of battles, most famously Blenheim, but also Ramillies and Oudenarde and so on. And this is most unexpected, though. No one really. The Tories were very unenthusiastic about the war. They sort of very grudgingly accepted it, and they thought, not unreasonably, because this was what you would have expected. Really, they thought, well, we're going to spend a lot of money on this war again. It's going to cost us a huge amount of money. The best that you could be hopeful is it will just get bogged down in an endless stalemate, and so they were like, well, this is pointless. Why are we getting involved in this? So it's quite unexpected that Marlborough then goes on and actually is incredibly successful, to the point where by 1709, the French basically are close to collapse, and it's only a very spirited and sort of resistance, led by Villars, the great French general. The French look like they're going to collapse. I mean, Louis XIV is at the point where he's like melting down the silverware in Versailles, because there's a famine. The French state's basically bankrupt. The Anglo-Dutch armies are, pushing in almost into the boundaries of France. Everyone thinks that the French are done for, and this is most unexpected. So this is. But if the French had have, prevailed or done much better in the War of Spanish Succession, the idea of a Jacobite restoration was not so stupid. It could have happened. It was not completely out of the question. So that is the other factor hanging over this. The reason why the Whigs are so keen on war, the reason they're so keen on, they think that it has to be fought at any cost, and so on, and they're keen, and hence they're keen on, ever higher taxes, setting up the Bank of England, so on, is because they think we have to fight the French because the French are sort of proxies for the Jacobites, basically. The Jacobite court is literally in Saint-Germain in France. So, with the Tories, it's not the case that the Tories are very equivocal about the succession, right? They're very divided. This is one of the reasons that ultimately they lose, because they do lose. I mean, the Whigs prevail when Queen Anne dies. And the basic reason is because the Tories broadly, early on, particularly, they sort of accept the Glorious Revolution and they sort of acquiesce in it. And there's a lot of Tories probably the majority of the Tories don't really want the Stuarts back. They don't really they're not really Jacobites because they don't want a Roman Catholic king, and it's simple. And they're the Church of England men. And ultimately, when push comes to shove, they think we don't really want what they would describe as a papist king. But they're always more equivocal about it than the Whigs, because there's a wing of the Tories who are Jacobites, and they wax and wane in their power. Sometimes there's very few of them, or at least openly. But as time goes on, for various reasons, there are more overt Tory Jacobites, and even the Tories accept the Protestants. So the idea that this German family, the Hanoverians, will because Queen Anne doesn't have she has 17 pregnancies, and only one of them lives to be beyond infancy, and he dies when he's, I think, 11, isn't it? The Duke of Gloucester dies.
It's awful. It's awful. You feel about her mind, what goes through her mind.
I mean, Queen Anne has a terrible time of it. I mean, 17 pregnancies, most of them end in miscarriage, or a lot of babies dying, within a few hours or a few weeks or whatever. It's terrible. I mean, it's only her very strong religious faith, I think. She's a very devout Anglican that keeps her going, I think. And she's, I think she's quite an admirable figure in many ways.
It comes out, it's really interesting. Queen Anne in your book, actually.
Yeah. Well, I love Queen Anne. I won't lie. I'm very much a partisan for Queen Anne, but I don't think my take on Queen Anne is that essentially she's a very dutiful woman. She's got a lot of common sense. Even if she's often underestimated. She's not much of an intellectual, fair to say. She basically, the only books she reads are the Bible and the prayer book, which is, fair enough. But she's very religious. She's not a party animal. She's not witty, or, she finds those things difficult. She's quite a introverted and woman. But more often than not, her judgment ends up being, I think, probably more or less spot on. But she's always constantly having to deal with these presuming politicians of both parties who are trying to bully her into doing one thing or the other. And, generally speaking, I think that her judgment is usually like a good deal better than the sort of extremely arrogant male politicians who think they know better. I think she's usually vindicated, actually, because she's very dutiful. She works very hard, even though I don't think she probably would have voluntarily, it couldn't come naturally to her, but she has such a strong sense of religious faith and sense of duty that she works very hard at the business of state, and she has a sort of native common sense and a feel for what people I think she probably has a better feel for public opinion than a lot of the politicians do. Maybe not for the first or last time.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot to be said for, but but the Jacobite thing does hang over the whole thing, and is sort of the reason why ultimately the Tories can never quite, because there's even the Tories that are pro Hanoverian succession, so the Protestant Germans who will succeed Anne because she doesn't have children, and they're the next in line to the throne who are Protestants. They're actually like, was it a 70th in line to the throne or something? But because there's so many Catholics who are technically before in the throne, they're just a little German state that Hanover, they're the electors of Hanover in the enormously complicated tapestry which is the Holy Roman Empire, and it's very odd, really, if you think about it, that just for reasons of dynastic.
Yeah, George I was a lot more interested in Hanover even when he gets the.
Well, yeah, I mean, it becomes a big issue in British politics for decades. The Hanoverian, not only George I, George II, it's only really George III who is the first of the Hanoverian monarchs who sees himself as British more than he is German. But anyway, they're the solution to the problem of like you have to find someone to succeed to the throne. It can't be a Roman Catholic, and they're the best there is, basically. And the Tories are in a bit difficult because they don't really want the Stuarts, most of them, but they're all very unenthusiastic about the Hanoverian. And to be honest, not many, even some Whigs are not that enthusiastic about the Hanoverians because they're not an attractive bunch, to be honest. I mean, when George I does become king, after the death of Queen Anne in 1714, it's fair to say he's not very popular amongst almost anybody. I mean, the Whigs are gung-ho in favour of their succession for political reasons because, obviously if the Jacobites were restored, the Whigs were in trouble, to put it mildly. And the whole post-war revolution political settlement, everything depends on the Stuarts not getting that. The Whigs have sort of built up. All depends on the Hanoverian succeeding. But even the Whigs are, he doesn't speak very good English. He does sort of speak English, but not very well. He's obviously more interested in Hanover than he is England. He doesn't really hide this particularly. And he's famously mocked as the sort of fat German turnip farmer, particularly by the Jacobites, and so on. So the Tories are very unenthusiastic about him. And towards the end of the Queen Anne reign, the reign of Queen Anne, basically, to sum it up very crudely, what happens is the Tories disintegrate into total disunity over the succession question, which is what does for them in the end, because the Whigs are absolutely united. Well, partly the fact that the Hanoverian monarchy is very pro-Whig as well, which obviously is the ultimate factor, I suppose. But politically, the Tories are completely all over the place on the succession question. They divide into about endless different parliamentary factions. There are Hanoverian Tories. There's the March Club, who are like the pro-Hanoverian Tories, and then there's the October Club, which is somewhere in between, and then there's a group of Jacobite Tories.
They're now called research groups, aren't they?
Yeah, a similar sort of dynamic in a way, and a bit like the Tories. In many cases, for a long time, tearing strips out of each other over Brexit. It's not a million miles in a way. It's somewhat similar. Whereas the Whigs are completely united on the question. They're completely pro Hanoverian succession, and that is ultimately one of the main reasons why the Tories for the Tories. And then once George becomes king, the Tories are proscribed from office. Like they exist. I mean, I'm hoping I might write a sequel to this, which will be about.
Oh, well, that would be wonderful.
Which would be about basically
Walpole's dominance of the
because Walpole doesn't come in his book very much. He does a bit, but Walpole is a bit part. He's not a huge. He's an important-ish Whig player towards the end of my book, but he's not that central. You wouldn't necessarily in 1714. You wouldn't. There was no reason to predict that he was going to go on to be the dominant figure. There were various other people who had better, who you would have probably thought had more chance. But so the story of Walpole's rise, and he's quite an interesting one. He's an interesting character. Sort of on the one hand, a genius. On the other hand, not a man over troubled with moral principles. I think it's fair to say.
No.
But he's anyway. So that would be that would hopefully might be a sequel. But just very quickly, the Tories don't die. I mean, they linger on for a long time after the Hanoverian succession, but basically they're sort of prescribed from office. They're tolerated as long as, but they never have a chance of gaining leadership in the government ever again. And the Whigs basically, I mean, the only thing that threatens the Whigs after that is the fact the Whigs are quite prone to fall out amongst themselves. Once the threat of the Hanoverian of a Jacobite restoration more or less goes away, although it lingers on to some extent, and the Whigs are firmly in control. Of course, there's an element, as usually is the case, when you take a group that comes and becomes very dominant, then sort of has the luxury of being able to fall out amongst itself, and so they have various fallings out, and which are usually based more on personality, or at least as much on personality as they are really on principle. But the Tories linger on, but they never really have much of a chance of gaining power ever again. Sorry,
Right.
I spoke for a long time.
No, not at all. It's riveting stuff. It really is. And I think this should set listeners up to get the book. So, of course, the link will be in the show notes for them. Yeah, I mean, it really is. For many who may be unfamiliar or a little bit nervous with these sort of huge costumes, that's part of the fun. So,
yeah, all the wigs and stuff. I mean, I would stress there's a lot of fighting, sex scandals, drinking. They're always drunk, basically. I think everybody in Britain before the 19th century seemed to be drunk most of the time. So
happier times.
Yes. So there is plenty. There's not just high parliamentary strategy and stuff. There's plenty of that, but there's also
but you've got a really good eye for an amusing story or anecdote in it as well, which helps the narrative run along.
Well, I'd left in all of the. I got frustrated because often. So there's several characters that are really colourful. Like, so Wharton, who is one of the leading Whigs, and Viscount Buddenbrook, who's one of the leading Tories, are rakes on a proper 18th century scale. You know, they love nothing better than washing down, a huge meal with three bottles of Burgundy and then going off to see a prostitute. I mean, that's their idea of a night out, basically, and then having a fight usually at some point. And it's so frustrating that academic books on this, like the several biographies of these people, they won't really mention them.
Yeah.
They'll sort of in a footnote they'll mention some of this stuff, and I was thought, well, come on, I don't just want to hear about his views on the Property Qualification Act 1711. I also want to hear, about his mistresses and the jewels and and that sort of thing, because that sort of makes the story quite a lot more colourful. And that's part of the reason I wrote the book, to leave all that stuff in, basically.
Yeah. Well, George, thanks so much. This has been fantastic.
Great, thanks for having me and everything, and
a pleasure.
I hope people will buy the book. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've come to the end of this club meeting, so thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch about club benefits, please do, either by email or on X or Instagram. Links are in the show notes. I've also included my Substack link so members can read articles I've written on various matters that may be of interest. The History Book Club is written and presented by me, Oliver Webb-Carter. Music is by listener Chat DMZ. Episodes continue next week and every week, so please do join, subscribe, and if you can provide the club with a 5-star rating, we would be delighted. In the meantime, I thank you again, and now I have to usher members out into the real world. Until next time.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kann du Norsk?
If you used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world, with lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers. Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Spotify. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify. Rules and restrictions may apply.